After my father's funeral, my brother banged his fist on the table and said, "Dad promised me half of your business, so hand over the keys now." He even waved a signed paper in my face. I tried to hold back my laughter, because my father had already moved his assets into my name. I, 42M, was standing in my father's study when my brother stormed in, his face flushed red, still wearing his funeral suit. The wake had ended barely an hour ago, and most guests were still mingling downstairs with their sympathy cards and half-eaten casseroles. But my brother had other priorities. He slammed his fist on the mahogany desk so hard that Dad's old brass compass jumped, and told me Dad had promised him half of my business. He demanded I hand over the keys right then and there. I watched him wave a piece of paper in my face, his hand trembling with either rage or excitement, maybe both. The document looked official enough, with Dad's signature scrawled at the bottom in that shaky handwriting he'd developed in his final months. My brother's eyes were wild, victorious even, as if he'd just won the lottery instead of burying our father that morning. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. The business he was talking about was a commercial printing company I'd built from scratch over 15 years. Dad had invested the initial seed money back when I was 27, fresh out of a failed corporate job and desperate to prove myself. I turned his $40,000 loan into a $3 million operation with 23 employees and contracts with major retailers across the state. My brother, meanwhile, had spent those same 15 years bouncing between get-rich-quick schemes and blaming everyone else when they inevitably collapsed. I asked him calmly where he got that paper. He told me Dad had given it to him 3 months ago during one of his visits. He said Dad felt guilty about favoring me all these years and wanted to make things right. The document apparently entitled him to 50% ownership of the printing company, effective immediately upon Dad's death. I nodded slowly and asked if I could see it. My brother hesitated, probably sensing something in my tone, but his greed won out. He thrust the paper toward me, confident in his victory. The document was professionally formatted. I'd give him that. It laid out the terms clearly. I was to transfer half of all business assets, intellectual property, and future profits to my brother within 30 days of our father's passing. Dad's signature was at the bottom, witnessed by someone I didn't recognize. My brother had done his homework, or at least paid someone who had. I set the paper down on the desk and told him it was an interesting piece of fiction. His face darkened immediately. He demanded to know what I meant, voice rising loud enough that I worried the remaining guests downstairs might hear. I said the signature might be Dad's, but the document itself was worthless. Dad couldn't sign away something he didn't own. My brother's confusion was almost comical. He insisted Dad had been my primary investor, and that gave him the right to transfer ownership. I shook my head and explained that Dad had indeed started as an investor, but I'd bought him out completely 9 years ago. Every share, every percentage point, every bit of ownership had been transferred to me in 2016. Dad no longer had any legal stake in my company to give away. The color drained from my brother's face. He called me a liar and said Dad never mentioned anything about that. I walked to the filing cabinet in the corner, the same one where Dad kept all his important documents, and pulled out a folder. Inside were copies of the buyout agreement, notarized and filed with the state. Dad had signed everything over to me for $230,000, which I'd paid in full over 3 years. I watched my brother's hands shake as he looked through the papers. He kept insisting there had to be a mistake, that Dad wouldn't have done this without telling him. I reminded him that he'd been in Arizona 9 years ago, hiding from creditors after his solar panel pyramid scheme collapsed. He hadn't spoken to Dad for nearly 2 years during that period. He'd missed a lot. My brother threw the papers back at me and accused me of manipulating Dad, of stealing what should have been a family business. I stayed calm and pointed out that he'd never shown any interest in the printing company until exactly 5 minutes after Dad's funeral. In 15 years, he'd visited the facility exactly twice, both times to ask for money. He started pacing, running his hands through his hair. I could see him trying to calculate his next move. Finally, he stopped and said that even if the business was mine, Dad still had other assets. The house we were standing in, the rental properties, the investment accounts. He demanded to know what I was planning to do about those. I told him the truth. Dad had transferred most of his major assets into my name over the past 2 years. The house, both rental properties, and roughly 80% of his investment portfolio. Everything had been done legally, with proper documentation and tax planning. Dad had been very clear about his intentions. My brother's face went from white to purple. He screamed that it was impossible, that Dad would never cut him out like that. I corrected him and said Dad hadn't cut him out completely. There was still the savings account with about $18,000, Dad's car, and some personal items. Plus, Dad had a small life insurance policy worth $50,000 that listed both of us as equal beneficiaries. The math clearly wasn't adding up the way my brother had hoped. He accused me of elder abuse, of taking advantage of Dad's declining mental state. I almost lost my composure then. I told him Dad had been sharp as a tack until his final week, sharper than my brother would ever be. Every transfer had been reviewed by Dad's attorney, his financial advisor, and his doctor. There was documentation for everything, including notarized statements of Dad's mental competency. My brother demanded to know why. Why would Dad do this to him? Why would he leave everything to me? I sat down in Dad's chair and looked at my brother, really looked at him. He was 45 years old and had nothing to show for it except debt and broken promises. I told him the truth as gently as I could manage. Dad had given him chances. So many chances. The money for the restaurant that my brother gambled away in Atlantic City. The investment in the real estate course that turned out to be a scam. The loan for the food truck that my brother sold for cash and then claimed was stolen. Every time, my brother had promised it would be different. Every time, Dad had believed him because that's what fathers do. But 2 years ago, my brother had crossed a line. He'd forged Dad's signature on a credit card application and racked up $30,000 in charges. Dad had found out when the creditors started calling. He'd paid it off to protect his credit, but something broke in him that day. My brother started to protest, to make excuses, but I held up my hand. I told him I'd been there when it happened. I'd sat with Dad in this very study while he cried, actually cried, over what his youngest son had become. Dad had asked me then to help him protect his assets because he knew my brother would eventually come after them. Not might come after them. Would. I pulled out another folder, this one containing letters. Dad had written one to each of us, to be opened after his death. I'd read mine that morning before the funeral. It was full of love and pride and gratitude for the life we'd built together. I handed my brother his envelope. He tore it open with shaking hands. I couldn't see what it said, but I watched his face as he read. I saw anger morph into confusion, then into something that might have been grief. The letter was 3 pages long. Dad had explained everything, I knew. Why he'd made the decisions he had. How much it hurt him. How he still loved my brother, but couldn't enable his self-destruction anymore. My brother's legs seemed to give out. He collapsed into the leather chair by the window, the same chair where Dad used to read the newspaper every morning. He asked, voice barely a whisper, if there was any way to contest this. Any legal avenue he could pursue. I told him he could try. He could hire a lawyer and drag this through probate court for the next 2 years. He could spend whatever money he had left fighting a battle he couldn't win. Or he could accept reality and figure out what to do next with his life. His choice. The silence stretched between us. Downstairs, I could hear my wife starting to usher the last guests out. My kids were probably tired and confused, too young to really understand why Grandpa wasn't coming back. My brother looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes and asked why I didn't just tell him earlier. Why let him make a fool of himself with that fake document? I considered lying, making it easier on both of us, but Dad had taught me better. I said I wanted to see how far he'd go. I wanted to know if he'd show up to our father's funeral already plotting how to profit from his death. Now I knew. He flinched like I'd slapped him. He asked what he was supposed to do now. He had rent coming due, car payments, credit cards. The $50,000 from the life insurance would barely cover his immediate debts. I stood up and straightened Dad's compass on the desk. I told my brother I wasn't heartless despite what he might think. The rental properties Dad had transferred to me generated decent income. I'd continue to receive that income, but I'd set aside a monthly amount for my brother. Not much, maybe $1,500. Enough to keep him from being homeless, but not enough to fund another disastrous business venture. The arrangement would continue as long as he stayed clean, stayed out of trouble, and made a genuine effort to get his life together. My brother stared at me like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. He asked what the catch was. I told him there wasn't one, except that the first time he forged my signature, stole from me, or tried to manipulate my kids the way he'd manipulated Dad, the money would stop permanently. No second chances, No explanations needed. He wanted to know why I'd do that after everything he'd put me through, put Dad through. I thought about it for a moment. The truth was complicated. Part of me wanted to cut him off completely, to let him crash and burn and maybe finally learn something from it. But another part, the part that sounded like Dad's voice in my head, knew that family was family even when they didn't deserve it. I told him it was what Dad would have wanted. Not the enabling, not the endless chances, but the basic safety net. Dad had been clear about that in his planning. He wanted my brother taken care of at a subsistence level, but nothing more. He'd trusted me to enforce those boundaries because he knew he never could. My brother folded up Dad's letter and put it in his jacket pocket. He asked if he could keep the compass from the desk, said he remembered Dad using it on their camping trips when he was young, back before everything got complicated. I picked it up and handed it to him. It was worth maybe $40, nothing in the scheme of things. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. He said he knew I probably didn't believe him, but he really had loved Dad. He'd just been terrible at showing it. I nodded and told him I knew. That was the tragedy of it all. Dad had known it too. After he left, I sat alone in the study for a while. The house felt empty despite my family waiting downstairs. I pulled out my own letter from Dad and read it again. There was a section near the end I kept coming back to. Dad had written that his biggest failure as a father wasn't in how he'd handled me, but in how he'd handled my brother. He'd been too soft, too forgiving, too willing to believe the next time would be different. By the time he'd realized his mistakes, the patterns were too entrenched to break. Dad had asked me not to repeat those mistakes, to love my brother, but not to lose myself in the process, to help him, but not to enable him. It was a thin line to walk, and I wasn't sure I was up to the task. Update 1. 3 weeks after the funeral, I got a call from my brother. He'd found a job doing inventory management at a warehouse. The pay was decent, union benefits, room for advancement. He wanted me to know he was trying. I told him I was glad to hear it and meant it. The $50,000 from Dad's life insurance came through. My brother used $28,000 to pay off his most pressing debts. He put the rest in a savings account and showed me the statements without me even asking. It was a small gesture, but meaningful. I started sending him the monthly stipend I'd promised. $1,500 on the first of each month, direct deposit. No strings attached beyond our original agreement. He never missed a rent payment. But about 2 months in, I got a call from Dad's attorney. My brother had been asking questions about the asset transfers, specifically whether there was any time limit on contesting them. The attorney had shut him down professionally, but he'd felt obligated to give me a heads up. I confronted my brother over coffee. He didn't deny it. He said he'd been angry, feeling like he'd gotten screwed, and wanted to know his options. But after talking to 3 different lawyers, he'd realized what I'd already told him. There was nothing to contest. Everything had been done properly, and no judge would overturn Dad's clearly stated wishes. I asked him if he was done now, if we could move forward. He said he thought so, but then added something that surprised me. He said he'd been going to therapy, using part of his warehouse income to see someone once a week. The therapist had been helping him understand his relationship with Dad, with money, with himself. It was hard work, facing all the ways he'd screwed up. I didn't know what to say to that. I told him I was proud of him for trying. He laughed bitterly and said I shouldn't be proud yet. He was still angry about everything, still felt like Dad had given up on him. But he was trying to understand why, trying to take responsibility for his part in how things had fallen apart. We talked for 2 hours that day. Really talked, maybe for the first time in our adult lives. He admitted things I'd suspected but never confirmed. The gambling had been worse than anyone knew. The debts had been deeper. There'd been a period where he'd been using cocaine regularly, though he'd been clean for 4 years now. Every bad decision had led to another bad decision, until he couldn't see a way out except through Dad's wallet. I shared things too. How angry I'd been when Dad kept bailing him out. How I'd resented being the responsible one, the one who did everything right and got treated like it was expected. How part of me had wanted Dad to cut my brother off years ago, just to prove a point. My brother asked if I'd influenced Dad's decision to transfer the assets. I told him the truth. Dad had come to me with the plan already formed. I'd supported it because I thought it was necessary, but the idea had been entirely his. I'd just helped execute it. Update 2. 6 months after Dad's death, my brother got promoted to shift supervisor. The raise wasn't huge, but it came with better hours and more stability. He started dating someone he'd met at work, a woman with 2 kids from a previous marriage. He brought her to Sunday dinner at my house, nervous as a teenager. She was good for him. I could tell immediately. She didn't take his crap and called him out when he started making excuses. But she also saw something in him worth investing in. My wife liked her, which was saying something. My wife had been skeptical of my brother's redemption arc from the start. Around the 8-month mark, my brother asked to meet with me and Dad's attorney together. I went in prepared for another fight about the inheritance. Instead, he wanted to set up a proper financial plan. He'd been saving money and wanted advice on investing it properly. He wanted to know about retirement accounts and emergency funds and all the boring, responsible things he'd never cared about before. The attorney and I spent 3 hours walking him through the basics. My brother took notes, asked intelligent questions, actually seemed engaged. When we finished, he thanked us both and said something that stuck with me. He said Dad would have loved seeing this, seeing him finally get his act together. But the sad part was, Dad had to die before he could figure it out. I started inviting my brother over more regularly. He'd help me with projects around the house, play with my kids, talk about normal mundane things like sports and weather. The girlfriend became a regular presence too. My kids started calling her aunt, even though nothing was official yet. But then the first anniversary of Dad's death approached, and things got complicated again. My brother called me a week before the date and said he wanted to visit Dad's grave together. He wanted to tell Dad about his progress, about how he was doing better. I agreed. We met at the cemetery on a cold Saturday morning. My brother had brought flowers, which touched me more than I expected. We stood in front of the headstone in silence for a long time. Finally, my brother started talking. He spoke to Dad like he was standing right there. He apologized for everything, for being such a disappointment, for forcing Dad to make impossible choices. He promised he was changing, that he was becoming someone Dad could have been proud of. He cried, really sobbed, in a way I'd never seen him do even at the funeral. I put my hand on his shoulder and let him grieve. When he finally composed himself, he turned to me and said he needed to tell me something. My stomach dropped, prepared for whatever confession was coming. He said he'd found the forged document, the one he'd waved in my face the day of the funeral. It had been created by a woman he'd been involved with briefly, someone who'd convinced him Dad owed him more. She'd forged Dad's signature, fabricated the witness, made the whole thing look legitimate. My brother had paid her $2,000 for it, money he'd borrowed from a loan shark. I asked why he was telling me this now. He said because his therapist had made him realize he couldn't move forward while holding on to that lie. He needed to come clean completely. He was also turning himself into the police for the credit card fraud from 2 years ago, the one Dad had paid off. The statute of limitations hadn't expired, and he needed to face real consequences for once. I tried to talk him out of it. He'd already lost so much, and prosecuting him wouldn't bring Dad back. But my brother was insistent. He said it was the only way he could truly start over, with a clean slate. He'd already spoken to a lawyer about turning himself in and accepting whatever charges came. 2 weeks later, my brother pleaded guilty to identity theft and fraud. The judge, hearing about his recent progress and employment, gave him 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered him to continue therapy. It could have been much worse. My brother seemed almost relieved. Update 3. It's been 18 months now since Dad died. My brother is still working at the warehouse and got another promotion. He's engaged to his girlfriend, and they're planning a small wedding next spring. He's been clean, honest, and consistent in ways I never thought possible. The monthly stipend continues, though my brother has told me several times he doesn't need it anymore. I keep sending it anyway, putting it directly into an investment account I set up in his name. He doesn't know yet, but by the time he's 60, it should be worth a decent amount. Maybe enough to retire on if he keeps contributing. Last month, my brother did something that completely floored me. He showed up at my office with a check for $40,000. It was every penny Dad had ever given him that he could document, plus interest. He said he'd been saving aggressively, cutting expenses, even taking on side work. He couldn't pay back everything Dad had lost on him, but he wanted to pay back what he could track. I tried to refuse it, but he insisted. He said he needed to do this for himself. So I took the check and told him I'd donate it to the community college's business program in Dad's name. Dad had always believed in education and second chances. It seemed fitting. My brother and I have dinner together every week now. We talk about real things, not just surface pleasantries. He's become someone I actually want to spend time with. My kids adore him. His fiancée fits into our family like she's always been there. Sometimes I wonder what Dad would think of all this. Whether he'd be happy with how things turned out or disappointed it took his death to trigger the change. My wife thinks Dad knew exactly what he was doing. By putting everything in my name and forcing my brother to face reality, Dad had given him the only gift that could actually help. The gift of hitting bottom with a safety net still intact. The business Dad helped me start all those years ago is doing better than ever. I think about him every time I walk through the facility, seeing the machines running and the employees working. He'd be proud of what we built together. And maybe, finally, he'd be proud of my brother too. Not for the success or the money or the conventional markers of achievement, but for the harder thing, the more important thing. For finally growing up and taking responsibility for his own life. I still have Dad's letter in my desk drawer. I read it sometimes when I'm struggling with a decision. The last paragraph has become my compass, more valuable than any inheritance. Dad had written that love without boundaries isn't really love at all. It's just enabling wrapped in sentiment. Real love means letting people face consequences while still being there to help them stand back up. I think I'm finally understanding what he meant. My brother will never get the business or the properties or the money he thought he deserved. But he got something better. He got a chance to become someone worth being. And in the end, that might have been what Dad was trying to give him all along. If you like this story, please like this video and subscribe us for more such real-life-based stories. Thanks in advance.